Why we're surrounded by
Welcome back. It is day 25 of our 90-day New Testament reading plan with New Life Youth. My name is Christian. I'm glad you're here and joining us today. Today's reading takes us through John chapter 7 through John chapter 9. Now, at the start of chapter 7, what we are seeing here is Jesus dealing or talking with his brothers. They are saying to him essentially, if you really are the Messiah, you're going to go to Judea and you're going to put on a show. Show your disciples, just show everyone if you really are the Messiah. If you really want to be this public figure, go ahead and put on a show, Jesus. Jesus' brothers don't believe at this point that he is the Messiah. And really, they don't really believe or submit to him as Messiah until after his death and resurrection. We don't see a lot of evidence showing that they support him. Now, this does not necessarily mean that they don't believe that Jesus performed miracles or wrought miracles, but they simply did not submit to him as Messiah, like we saw his disciples do, like we would see Peter do. It's really not until after his death or resurrection that we see Jesus' brothers numbered among the disciples. But this leads us into something that we've seen several times from Jesus throughout the Gospels, but we haven't touched on yet. Jesus says his time hasn't come yet. He tells his brothers to go to this feast. I'm not going at this time, essentially, is what Jesus says. If Jesus were to go with his brothers, the situation would have looked kind of like a big caravan of people going together. I think in our heads we're like, well, what's the big deal? You're just going with a couple of people. But them traveling to this feast together would have been a large caravan of people going. Jesus' enemies, at this point, they're looking for Jesus. They got their eyes out for Jesus. They're trying to arrest him if the opportunity happens. And it was likely if he was traveling with a large caravan of people, he is going to be spotted and likely arrested ahead of the timeline that God wanted for him. And this would have progressed his timeline a little too quickly according to the timeline of God the Father. And there is this understanding that God the Father has a timeline in mind. And what Jesus is doing is he is submitting to God the Father's timeline. For his death and resurrection. Sometimes we'll see things like this where Jesus, in this case, it says he went in secret or tried to be, a little bit more secretive about his entering of the temples and this feast. Or we see times where he encourages people that he heals not to go and tell everyone or ask them to keep it to themselves, especially if you think back to Jairus and his daughter when she was healed. We see in the book of Mark that Jesus gives strict orders not to spread the word. It's kind of like, well, why? I don't understand. Doesn't he want people to know who he is? Yes, he does. But Jesus understands that God the Father's timeline is different than our timeline. And the Father is ensuring that his death and resurrection would come to pass. Jesus is ensuring that his death and resurrection would come to pass in the Father's time and not his own. And he's not trying to expedite that process. And so this is another moment where Jesus is submitting to God the Father. It's a clear example of submission. And he is saying, okay, this has got to be according to God's plan, God the Father's plan. Now, throughout the rest of his time at the feast, we see Jesus is teaching and he's presenting himself as God, as Christ. He's presenting himself as God, as from heaven. Like we talked about in the beginning of John is showing us that Jesus came from heaven. That is so much of what this gospel is showing us, that we might believe that he is God, he is from heaven. And we see this division coming about amongst the people. Some people are listening and some say, surely this man is a prophet. Others will say he is the Christ, and others argue, how can the Christ come from Galilee? There's this clear division over Jesus presenting himself as the Messiah. There's even this moment from some of the Jews of a definitive denial of who Jesus is. When we, I think, fast forward to chapter 8, Jesus is presenting himself as God, and these Jews respond. They say, aren't we right in saying you are a Samaritan and demon possessed? And this is not simply just like an insult or trying to write him off. What they are doing is they're denying the claims of Jesus. They've heard, they've seen miracles, they've seen what he's done, they've seen his ministry, him presenting himself as the Christ, as the Messiah. And when they say you are a Samaritan, they're basically saying, no, you're not the Christ. You're not the Messiah. That's what they're saying. When they call him a Samaritan, they're saying you're not the Messiah. We don't think you are the Messiah, because the Messiah could not come from Samaria. There were certain things in prophecy that had to be fulfilled. Now Jesus did fulfill them all, but they are claiming that he is from Samaria. Clearly, he's not. He's born in Bethlehem, and comes from Nazareth. When they do this, though, they're saying, we deny the claim that you are the Messiah. And there's this pride and there's this blindness about these people, about these Pharisees, where they just refuse to accept he is the Christ. Then we fast forward to this story of this blind man, which kind of follows up this denial of Jesus as the Messiah from these individuals. And it's really no wonder that this story follows up what we just saw play out of these people denying Jesus, because it's this parallel in refusal to recognize Jesus as Christ. It's a spiritual blindness that Jesus talks about. So we have this man who is born blind, he is healed, and when he's healed, the Pharisees bring him in to question him, and they further just deny Jesus. They deny that he is from God. They deny that he's the Christ. This blind man is astounded at them. He was just healed, and he presented himself to them. He was blind from birth. No one else has been able to heal him, and then Jesus does. How could they deny Jesus is God? And you even see the testimony from this blind man, and he's like, what are you guys talking about? You must believe. There's no other way he could be from heaven or be from God with what he's done. How else could you explain this? And of course, we see the Pharisees throw this man out. But Jesus, what he does after he meets this man, after he's been thrown out again, he meets him again after being thrown out. And Jesus points out to the Pharisees that they are guilty. That they're guilty, that they claim they can see, they claim they have spiritual sight, and yet they deny Jesus, they deny God right in front of them. They're denying God, who is in the flesh, directly in front of them. They're denying God. They're claiming to have this spiritual sight, but they deny God who is right in front of them. So all throughout today's reading, we are seeing that Jesus is presented as Christ, as the Messiah. And there are these people who are watching it unfold, and they are just denying. They're just denying the Messiah. Even Jesus' brothers don't submit to Jesus' authority as Messiah yet. Like, that'll happen later for sure. But in the midst of it, in the midst of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, being here present, they're not submitting to him. How do we respond, though? Because that's the question I think we have to ask ourselves, because I'm sure all of us have seen people who have encountered God, but they end up choosing their own way. We might have even done that ourselves. We've encountered God, and we sometimes still choose our own way. Sometimes we choose spiritual blindness over spiritual sight. And we have to ask ourselves, am I going to remain stuck in my pride? Will I remain stuck in my ego or my selfishness, or stuck in, you fill in the blank? I don't know what that looks like for everyone. But when I'm presented with God, when we're presented with God, with Jesus the Messiah, will we submit, or will we choose our own way? Will we submit, or will we choose our own way? So we see that Jesus is able to submit to God the Father, to God the Father's timeline. Jesus submits not only to God the Father, though, and he, even as God, as he is God, he submits to his parents. We see that over the course of Scripture. We see that he submits to his parents, and he obeys his parents. He submits to his stepfather, and even takes on his stepfather's trade as a carpenter. The submission is a part of Jesus' life. If Jesus as God can submit and does submit, it's a characteristic that we see that says we should be able to follow suit. If Jesus, who is God, can submit to his earthly parents, I should be able to submit to my authorities. I should be able to submit to God. It's an important characteristic that we have to take on, this idea of submission. And so when we're presented with God, am I going to choose my own way and remain spiritually blind like these Pharisees? Or am I going to submit? And really, we want to understand that being spiritually blind is not just fully denying God altogether or denying who Jesus is altogether. But when we are called to submit it is all areas of our life. It's not just one thing. It is all areas, all aspects of our life. And so I could be submitting in one area and holding off in other areas. There might be areas of my life that I'm clinging to so hard that I refuse to submit. But when we are called to submit, so it is all areas of our life. And so are there areas of our lives that we are choosing spiritual blindness over spiritual sight? Are we choosing spiritual blindness over submission? Should we be choosing submission in certain areas in our life where we're not? And so I would just encourage you and myself, let's choose submission. Let's choose to spiritually see in all areas of our lives. Okay, so that really does it for today's video, though. Let's choose to spiritually submit and not remain spiritually blind. Get out of our own ways, right? So, but for today, that wraps us up. So, what I want you to do, there's so much that we could be talking about from these chapters. So, make sure if there's something else that's stuck out to you, something you're seeing, make sure to let us know in these comments. What did you take away from today's reading? Connect with us here on YouTube or in our YouVersion Bible plan, and we plan to see you tomorrow.